What would happen if I told you not to think of a blue dog riding a horse? Okay, how many in here thought of the dog? Okay, are you crazy? Do you know what kind of consequence that could have on your life? Do you know how dangerous that could be? Just 5 seconds ago, I told you not to think of it, and here you are thinking about it anyways. Of course, there won't be any consequences, but what you just did is you unfollowed my order. And that's kind of what I'd like to do too. If there are any doctors here tonight, you might say that I have a bit of a mental condition since early childhood. I mean, do you know any other 7-year-old who all of a sudden decides to not eat meat anymore, much to the detriment of my parents? But I would like to share with you a much more recent unfollowing story. And ironically, that unfollowing story started here. That's Game Over. It's a bar in Bangkok where I used to live. I used to live in Bangkok, work at a job I loved, for a boss I admire. I was surrounded by people who were really, really exciting. And one day, my best friend, who's also here this evening, calls me and says, hey, this guy called Alan is in town. You guys should go for a drink. You probably hit it off. I was like, sure, okay. So I was there at Game Over waiting until half an hour later when Alan shows up. He wasn't just late, but he was completely drenched. He had gotten into a complete thunderstorm, as is normal in Bangkok, on his motorbike to get to that place. But he didn't care about the rain, and he got there, and yeah, we hit it off. But we didn't know back then that in the meantime, I would leave my job, move away from a place I really liked, and that we would together start a bodywear brand together. And what we definitely didn't know is that within 24 months, we would have sold products in 120 countries around the world. And what we absolutely didn't know either is that we would have an online community that we would talk to and engage with on a day-to-day basis of 100,000 guys out there in all those countries communicating with each other without any borders. Because when we started, we didn't have any idea about fashion. We don't have a fashion background. We didn't know anything about sustainable fabrics. We didn't know how to operate the supply chain of that. But what we did is we just started asking questions. And we started asking more questions. And we think that because we weren't just asking questions and we weren't just listening, but we were actually executing of what everyone was telling us, more and more people started wanting to contribute and join and work together on building this brand. What we didn't know at the time, because we were just doing what we thought was right, was that we were actually completely unfollowing industry standards. In the fashion industry, as in any brand, you'll have a brand manager and you'll have a marketing person, and they'll decide where the brand goes. You'll have a product development person. And we were just letting the community guide us where it should go, where the journey should go. So we then realized that that was different. To us, it was just normal. And we realized it had a name. It was called collaborative creation. And that was kind of a aha moment. It's like, aha, we're actually doing something that has a name. So we started looking, that's exciting. There might be other brands doing the same, so we might be looking at what they're also doing and so on. But we found out that we didn't see any other brand that did it in that way that we were doing it. So all of a sudden, I found myself having unfollowed a job I really liked, a career I liked. And as a brand, we were also unfollowing the industry standards. So that kind of got me thinking. It got me thinking, well, you know, what makes me unfollow? What is it? Why do I do that? And that process, I kind of course, I mean, the first point is always what comes up is an exciting feeling. You feel excited when you do something for the first time. And when you think, you know, you're doing something that is maybe crazy, that no one has done before, or that only very few people have done before, and it gives you this feeling of, wow, this is exciting, I want to do more of that. You know, like jumping from a cliff. It might be going to a remote place that no one has been to. Whatever it might be, it's very exciting. But at the same time, I kind of knew for myself, this is not sustainable. It's not a life I want to live, just running from one exciting thing to the next. And it seems kind of random and just disorganized and also very risky. So I thought, well, how can I lead this unfollowing thing with taking out that risk aspect and the randomness aspect? And I kind of built a little bit of a framework for myself that I call the options mindset. So the options mindset is what I call when I trust my ability, as we can all trust all our abilities to create options whenever we think we should be creating new options. Or in other words, there are no dead ends in life. We might not know what that situation is that we will be in, where we will need to create options yet, but we can all trust ourselves that once we hit a challenge, once we are in that position, we can come up with alternatives to the only thing we were seeing at the beginning. And just to be clear what it's not about either. So it's not about just having alternatives and just keeping all your options open all the time. And it's not about jumping from one thing to the next. And it's not about just thinking about your own options and your own alternatives. It's quite the opposite, as we will see later on. So I thought, wow, okay, this is kind of interesting, but I'm not in that mindset all the time. I'm completely not in that mindset, but it feels kind of right and it feels kind of good to be there. So how can I maximize my time, my own time, being in that mindset throughout every day? How can I spend as much time as possible? So I built 3 practicing arenas that help me to spend more time living in that mindset. And those arenas are, the first one, the arena of knowing yourself. The second one is the skill of responsibility. And the third one is the habit. So picture me, a few years ago back in Bangkok, at a job I love, at a place I love, surrounded by great people as well. And yet, back then, I took that decision to leave that. Seems kind of strange, no? But actually at the time, it was a very easy decision for me. And that was because I had spent quite some time before reflecting of what really, really matters to me at that specific time. And one thing that really helped me to boil that down was starting with the end in mind by Stephen Covey, who says, at the end of your life, what do you want to be perceived as, what do you want to have lived as? And when I started thinking about that more, I realized that I really wanted to, having lived abroad for almost 10 years, to be closer to my family, to my parents, grandparents, brother, and also to my old friends, and try to do something of my own. So those were the 2 findings for me. If you will, knowing yourself, it's an ongoing process, but it's one that gives you a direction. So once I started to get to know myself a little bit better, I thought, okay, great, I know this. But now, when you think about the blue dog, do you remember the blue dog? Okay. What you did there, you might have done it consciously, or you might have done it subconsciously. But you made a decision. When I told you to not think of that dog, you made a decision whether to think of it or not. And that decision, that very moment, just before you react to something, just before you act on something that is put onto you, is what Viktor Frankl calls the last of human freedoms. It's that freedom that no one can take away from you. But then once you take that decision, of course, you are responsible for making that decision as well. So if there were any consequences afterwards, you would have to carry those. So once you start to practice that moment, to be more conscious, to really think about what is it that I want to be responsible for, it's a very empowering feeling, and it's one that you want to live on more and have more and more of, to become more responsible for whatever you're doing. And it's a constant thing you need to improve as well. And the third point is the engine. Knowing yourself and knowing about responsibility, it's very nice, and we all get it. But what really makes you live that way is to make those things a habit for yourself. And as BJ Fogg puts really nicely in his research, it's something, a habit we can learn. We can learn new habits. So I've been practicing to put this mindset, the options mindset, more as a habit, as a default mode, as something I fall back to whenever I need to make a decision or whenever I'm engaging on day-to-day things even. Okay, so now you might turn to me and say, okay, well, you're proposing to me to do all this work. It sounds like a lot of work. Why should I be spending so much time on this? And it is a lot of work. I agree with that. But for me, from my perspective, it's been more than worthwhile. And that mainly for 3 reasons. The first one being that eventually you fear less because you can really commit and get on an adventure and trust yourself that you can, even if you face a challenge, get out of it. So you don't fear it so much anymore. And what that does also, I mean, even in a business setting, it puts you at a much better negotiating position. Because you can actually, if someone lays terms on your table, you don't have to accept them. You can just say, well, I could also come up with these alternatives and start the negotiating process. It puts you at a much better spot. And the second point is that you can be happier as well, just because of the first reasons as well, and put that more into your day-to-day life. And what I think is a beautiful thing is the third one, that I can be there more for the family and for the friends as well. And not just that, but that I got to create a really cool community that I'm not just there for them or they're there for me, but they are there for each other as well and support each other on whatever bothers them. So if you do decide to start practicing, to embark on this adventure, enjoy the side effects. Thank you.